what's happening at this very moment, halfway around the world, is going to have an enormous environmental impact as well as a human impact as well, and that is the attack on Gaza. It is night right now in Gaza, literally and figuratively. The single power plant was blown up, which is going to have catastrophic health consequences for the 1.8 million Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip. Have any of you been to Gaza? I have. And just to give you a little sense of what it's like, if you can imagine a small strip of land, it's 6 miles wide at its narrow point, 10 at its widest point, and 40 miles long. It borders the Mediterranean, Egypt, and then most of the strip is surrounded by Israel. And life there is very, very difficult. When I went there, it was interesting, one of the times I went there a couple of times, I was treated like a Palestinian, which was very instructive. My hair was dark then, so maybe I looked a little like a Palestinian. But we were all of us hauled out of a taxi and were yelled at by the Israeli soldiers at the Rafah, the Yeretz checkpoint. And they're saying, you know, Hawiya, Hawiya, which is one of the few Arabic words I knew at the time, which means identity card. And when I took out my US passport and they opened it, they were flabbergasted, and they said, David, you're from New York. You know, my uncle is in New York. Do you know him? He lives in Brooklyn. And I said, no, I didn't. I don't know why you're stopping our taxi. You know, we're on our way into Gaza. And, you know, he got all kind of apologetic. That was just one of my run-ins with Israeli security forces. On another occasion, I was hauled into a police station in Ramallah where I was asked to snitch on the people who had been organizing a demonstration in which I was participating in. And it was really interesting. The Israeli officer that was interrogating me didn't speak English well, unlike many Israelis, but he knew the word snitch. You know, it's just a very technical kind of word. So I found that very interesting. It must be part of his working vocabulary. I mean, the history of Gaza is linked to the history of the Palestinian people and what happened in 1948. Most of the residents in Gaza today are the grandchildren and children of refugees from 1948. So they have been displaced multiple times. And right now, because of the attack, close to 200,000 Palestinians have been displaced within Gaza again. And they're told by the Israeli military to move to clinics, to hospitals, to schools, to UN sites, and then those sites are bombed. There's literally nowhere to run. There is nowhere to hide in the face of the third or fourth most powerful military in the world. And why am I talking about Gaza and Palestine? You might be thinking, you know, you got some axe to grind. You know, there are terrible things happening in Mozambique, in Madagascar, in Benin, in Rwanda, in the Congo. Yes, terrible things are happening there, but the U.S. is not really heavily involved. The U.S. is not the enabler in those situations. We are the bankroller of the occupation, an occupation that has been going on since 1967, that has accelerated over the years with a massive colonization campaign. You have to see it to understand it, and it's so symbolic where the Israeli homes are vis-a-vis the Palestinian residents. These subdivisions, and it looks like San Diego. I mean, you think you might be in Encinitas or one of these big suburbs of San Diego, you know, swimming pools, parks, green trees, up and always on commanding heights, on hills looking down. And then you see the Palestinian areas, and they're gray, they're dark, they're not well lit, there are no swimming pools, there are no tennis courts, there are no community centers. And you see this incredible apartheid being formulated right in front of your eyes. Now, it's our taxpayer dollar that enables a lot of that to happen. Not all of it, but a good deal of it. And the United States, through administration after administration, this has nothing to do with Democrats or Republicans or liberals or conservatives. On this particular issue of supporting Israel, there is no daylight between any of the political parties or any of the major politicians. I mean, people have a really good feeling about Elizabeth Warren, right? The senator from Massachusetts. You have really good vibes about Bernie Sanders. Even they had to vote in this 100-0 Senate vote that Israel had the right to self-defense and has to, invade Gaza. I mean, it's shameful that politicians, even of that stature, feel they have to toe the line, feel that they cannot buck the powerful Israeli lobby in Washington. Now, Gaza was invaded by Israel in 1956 when Israel and Britain and France invaded Egypt in the Suez War. That was a time when U.S. policy, incidentally, was a little bit more balanced when it came to the Middle East. Eisenhower actually put pressure on Israel, Britain, and France to withdraw their invading forces from Egypt and from Sinai. Then in 1948, Egypt took control of the Gaza Strip. During the '67 war, Israel occupied it and remained the occupier for 38 years, until 2005, when it decided, not because they felt it was some moral right to withdraw their troops, they decided that the cost was too much for the Israeli budget to bear, and the fact that there were then 1.5 million Palestinians, they didn't like the demographics of that, because that would alter the population ratio within the Israeli state. So they withdrew in 2005, and then guess what? There was a democratic election in the West Bank and in Gaza. And in Gaza, Hamas won. And what was the response from the world's greatest democracy, our country, to a democratic election? It was to ignore it and to immediately label Hamas as a terrorist organization. The United States would have no relations with Hamas. And then the Israeli siege began almost in lockstep with that. And that is to say, all land entrances except one controlled by Egypt. The air and the sea are completely controlled by the Israeli military. So Gaza is an open-air prison. I'm trying to give you a sense of why people might want to break out of their prison, to change their circumstances, and to crack this blockade, which has induced enormous human suffering. There are worthy victims and unworthy victims. This is a construction that Noam Chomsky devised some years ago. When you are privileged and usually white and a member of the ruling class, if you're an American or an Israeli or a Brit or a French, your life is worth more than the life of another person, let's say in Indonesia or Pakistan or Yemen or Oman or Afghanistan. There is this division, and you can see that in the media coverage constantly. Just turn on CNN or any of the other major networks, PBS, and you see how lives are valued or undervalued. So there's been, numerous examples of, funerals for the Israeli soldiers. It's mostly been soldiers that have been killed. It's 55 is the number. I believe one was a Thai worker, and there were 2 Israeli civilians. The Palestinian death toll is right now at around 13 or 1,400. That's been pretty much par for the course. 10, 15, 20, 25 to 1, which is understandable given the defenselessness of the Palestinians. They have a few rockets and machine guns and the like, and the overwhelming force of the Israeli military. Now, some of you might remember Ariel Sharon, nicknamed the bulldozer for destroying so many Palestinian homes during the Israeli occupation of Gaza. You know, every once in a while, politicians let the cat out of the bag. This is what he said to a British journalist, talking about the Palestinians. We'll make a pastrami sandwich of them. We'll insert a strip of Jewish settlements in between the Palestinians right across the West Bank, so that in 25 years, neither the United Nations or the United States will be able to tear it apart. It reminded me of something George Shultz, who was Reagan's Secretary of State, said in the early 1980s after he had succeeded Alexander Haig in that position. He said, we, the Reagan administration, we are going to create such institutional structures with Israel that it will be impossible for any future U.S. administration to disentangle itself from this particular edifice. And indeed, that is what has happened. This is from Moshe Dayan, you know, great Israeli war hero, a guy who had a patch over one eye. This is what he said about Gaza. How can we complain about Gaza's hatred toward us? They have been sitting in refugee camps while right in front of them we are turning the land and villages of their parents into our homes. Another interesting thing, which basically people here don't know anything about realities in the Middle East. And why is that? Are Americans not gifted or talented? Of course we are. It's about propaganda. It's about media, corporate control of the media, corporations, news bureaus that take their cues from the White House, from the Pentagon, from the CIA, from the NSA. So there's very little accurate information here. For example, how many of you think the Palestinians control the West Bank? And that would be the home of a future Palestinian state. It's a rhetorical question. I suspect all of you think that is in fact the case. What is the actual reality as defined by the Oslo Accords in 1993? It's really interesting when you look at it. The West Bank is today divided into three areas: Area A, Area B, and Area C. Area A is 11% controlled by, it's 11% of the land is controlled by the Palestinian Authority. That is Mahmoud Abbas and kind of the successor groups to the PLO. Area A can be subjected to Israeli invasion, intrusion at any time. Then there's Area B, under joint Israeli and Palestinian control. Okay, so now I can do the math. 11%, 28%, that's 39%. The remaining 61%, Area C, is under total Israeli control. That's where the settlements are being built. That's where these apartheid roads are being constructed. So literally, I mean, you can see this. If you're a Palestinian with a Palestinian license plate, you cannot go on this particular highway. So imagine, you know, you're Boulder County residents and you want to go on I-25 or I-70, but you're not allowed on those roads. You need to have Denver license plates to travel on those particular roads. So in instance after instance, an apartheid edifice has been created, walls have been built, land has been stolen, confiscated, annexed, and also, crucially, water has been taken from under the West Bank. There are major aquifers there. Water is the name of the game in the Middle East in terms of the future. So it's a distressing situation. What can we do about it as Americans? Well, I think since we are the bankrollers, we are the diplomatic guarantors and protectors of Israel, we should be, you know, trying to leverage Jared Polis and Bennett and Hickenlooper and these, you know, and Udall's who's up for election, to think about, you know, some other universe, to think outside the box, not to repeat these same lines of propaganda. We support the state of Israel. Okay, support the state of Israel, but don't denigrate the rights of the indigenous population of Palestine. They too are human beings. They too deserve our attention, our comfort, our sympathy, and our support. And there was an interestingly revealing article in the New York Times in the last few days. You know, every once in a while, if you read between the lines, you can get great information from even our corporate media. And the Times had an article, it was headlined, most of the world frowns on Israel, what Israel is doing in Gaza, but not in the United States. And then if you read the article, you find out that why is most of the world frowning on what Israel is doing in Gaza? Well, it turns out that their media are slightly different from the very much lapdogs with laptops stenography that we get here that, you know, are really practicing prostitution. We have prostitutes. We don't have journalists. We, you know, men who are, and some women as well, you know, who are competing for the best hair on the air, who are, you know, proud to be invited to White House, you know, dinners and playing golf with the president and tennis with the Secretary of State and the like. So media are important. And that's why there is a different view outside the U.S. Even Canada, which right now is going through hell under a right-wing religious fundamentalist. I know that's an oxymoron. It's redundant. Stephen Harper, who is as pro-Israeli as anyone in the world. But even in Canada, where I've been spending a lot of bit of time, there's much better information about what's happening in Gaza and the West Bank. So information is really important. And the destruction of that energy, the power plant in Gaza, which has rendered that place absolutely dark. I don't know how people are going to drink water, get food. There goes your refrigeration. There goes your sewage. You know, as it is, with 1.8 million people packed into this little, you know, strip of land like sardines, it will make their life even more unbearable. And pumping, you know, thousands of gallons of diesel fuel into the atmosphere will, you know, also contribute to environmental degradation and further environmental destruction. There's a lot to say, and I'll just conclude by too many people in this country have been cowed, have been intimidated, have been afraid to speak up about what's happening in Palestine and to the Palestinian people. And they're afraid, for obvious reasons, of being called anti-Semitic or Holocaust denier or a Jew hater or even worse. These terms have to be refuted. In overwhelming instances, they're completely false. Granted, there are some people who are indeed anti-Jewish, and we have to denounce them. But most people are not, and that is a way of silencing dissent, of getting people to shut up, and we have to confront that. Because in a way, it actually dishonors the memory of those who did die in this atrocity, the Holocaust. Because it denigrates, you know, the enormity of that particular crime. Now, to get to the matter at hand, which is talking about the environment, the war on nature, the war on Pachamama, the war on Gaia, which is continuing unrelentingly. Human beings in the natural world are on a collision course. Human activities inflict harsh and often irreversible damage on the environment and on critical resources. If not checked, many of our current practices put at serious risk the future that we wish for human society and the plant and animal kingdoms, and may so alter the living world that it will be unable to sustain life in the manner that we know. Fundamental changes are urgent if we are to avoid the collision our present course will bring about. I wonder if anyone recognizes that particular comment. Wow. You wish. Well, like we say in New York, in your dreams. This was made in 1992. World scientists warning to humanity. 1,670 scientists, including 104 Nobel laureates, issued this very important statement that was completely ignored, as if it didn't happen. And now here we are, 22 years later, with a climate crisis and global warming right in our face. And and the kind of remedies that are being proposed is like moving deck chairs on the Titanic. And I say that, sure, we have Earth Day, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act. We even have an Environmental Protection Agency. You know, all of those things were passed by the last liberal president of the United States. Anyone name him? Richard Nixon. Yeah, Chomsky said, not ironically, the last liberal president. No one today, because of the extent of corporate power, because the oil and gas industry has both the Congress and the White House, and it looks like the Supreme Court too, under their thumb, no one could dream of passing an EPA or a Clean Water Act or a Clean Air Act. That tells you a lot about what's happened to our country over the last 30 or 40 years. It's been a huge shift to the right. It's been a huge shift away from democracy and into corporate control, plutocracy, corporatocracy. We're ruled by corporados, as they call them in India. You know, desperados, and then you have corporados. And the threat to our environment is acute and growing. The majority of solutions on offer, from driving a hybrid to recycling plastic to using efficient light bulbs, focus on individual life choices of mostly privileged people. You know, not all of us can shop and buy, you know, organic shiitake mushrooms at $27 a pound, or arugula at, you know, $7.99. You know, we have to go into the conventional, you know, vegetables. So it is, you know, it is a class privilege to think about, well, should I buy a Prius or a Honda, you know, that's a half hybrid, not a full hybrid, you know, and go back and forth on that kind of discussion. The scale of the crisis requires a far deeper and fundamental transformation. As global warming accelerates, carbon-fueled industrial capitalism is systematically, I think this is really important, it is institutionally incapable of addressing this problem. And I'll tell you why in just a moment. It is incapable of making the necessary radical changes to protect the planet. So it's not about applying a little rouge here, a little lipstick here, a little eyebrow shadow there. It's about fundamental radical change. And we are being given these reforms as kind of placebos. You know, recycle your cardboard, recycle your plastic, feel good about yourself. You know, and I do all these things. I'm not saying that they're bad, but we shouldn't delude ourselves that we're going to reverse the enormous problem that is facing not just the United States, but all the peoples and all the countries of the world. Capitalism's insatiable appetite for profits precludes it from addressing this problem. It is time to think about a different economic system. And it was Karl Marx, great 19th century economist and journalist, who spoke about the werewolf hunger of capitalism. It is like a werewolf that constantly needs to replenish, even a vampire, you can think of that, like constantly needs new victims, constantly needs to expand, to accumulate, to increase profits. If it doesn't, it will shrink and disappear and die. So according to a Canadian sociologist, James McMurtry, he says we're in the cancer stage of capitalism right now. The tumor is metastasizing, it's growing larger and larger, and ultimately it will eat and consume its host, that is to say, planet Earth. This is fundamental to the genetic makeup of this economic system. We're kidding ourselves if we think these placebos are going to turn the Titanic, you know, around, and we're going to avoid the iceberg that is clearly in front of us. It's going to take an enormous amount of societal pressure from the grassroots to get the leaderships of these countries away from the grip of the corporations and more responsive to the needs of Pachamama, to the needs of Mother Nature. You know, Chief Seattle and this is an apocryphal quote. Some of you may have heard it, but it doesn't matter if he said it or not. There is wisdom and there is veracity in it. He noticed among the European colonists that were streaming across North America, you know, wiping out the buffalo herds, massacring the Indians. He noticed that there was an enormous impulse, an enormous desire to accumulate goods by these colonists. And he said that if you continue soiling the bed in which you sleep, you will ultimately choke on your own toxic fumes. This was said, you know, well nigh 150, 170 years ago. And we are doing that, precisely that, right now, because of the, you know, the insatiable appetite that this economic system has for more and more growth. This is as if growth is the panacea. Growth that is not sustainable contributes to global warming, contributes to greenhouse gases, continues to accelerate climate change and what is called extreme weather or severe weather, which is becoming so routine that you know, it's not even getting like special treatment anymore. Tornadoes here, hurricanes there, floods here, and on and on. Droughts there. I was just in California a few days ago on Saturday in Anaheim, and Governor Brown there is now instituting rationing of water because of the acute drought that is plaguing that particular part of the country. Other parts of the country have too much rain, but in California, particularly in the Central Valley, there's not enough water, and that is connected to what's happening in Colorado with the shrinking of the glaciers. There's less water in the rivers that California uses to get irrigation water from Colorado rivers, and so prices are going to go up, food prices are going to go up. This is also a prescription for massive instability around the world. One of the things that sparked the Egyptian revolution in January 25th, not just the 30 years of US-supported Mubarak dictatorship, was a huge spike in wheat prices because of lack of water. Egypt is extremely water stressed. That entire basin, West Asia, North Africa, extremely water stressed. South Asia as well. And so bread prices were skyrocketing. People went into the streets. That was one of the main impetuses for overthrowing the Mubarak dictatorship. So we're going to see, unless things change, an enormous amount of civil conflict within states and among states, fighting over land, fighting over water, fighting over food. Without water, without sufficient water, there isn't sufficient food. You don't have to be, you know, some kind of genius to figure this out. There was a very prescient IMF, I know this sounds like a contradiction, an IMF vice president a few years ago. His name was Ismail Sarageldin. He said, in the past, there were wars about, you know, ivory and silver and gold, and right now the wars are about oil and natural gas. But in the future, he says the wars of the future in the 21st century are going to be wars for water. So I think that's, you know, again, with air temperatures rising, we are losing more and more water from lakes and you know, from rivers as well. That's why if this 2% prediction, which is very, very conservative, that the Earth's temperature is going to increase by 2 degrees centigrade. That would be 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. You know, Chomsky says, actually, in this new book that I have with him, that, you know, there's only 2 points of view that are allowed to be represented in the media. That is to say, the dominant one, which says that global warming is happening, and then a smaller group, which is very influential, funded by the oil and natural gas companies and the Koch brothers, that says that climate change is a hoax, it's bogus, don't worry about it. It's just a bunch of kids who have got nothing to do. They want to destroy capitalism, and they want to bring socialism to America, and they're using this as a kind of excuse. What's the third group? The third group of scientists believe the calculations and the numbers of the dominant group are way underrepresented, are overly conservative, and that the actual numbers should be much higher. They're completely cut out from the discussion or from any kind of attention in the corporate media. Let me get some ginger here. How you doing out there?
Good. Terrific.
Actually, so far.
All right, so far. So we have to be, I think, vigilant. We have to be careful about these elixirs that are offered up as solutions, you know, that will salve our liberal consciences. You know, in Santa Fe, there's a bad joke because there's so many Priuses there. It's a very wealthy community, even more than Boulder, and they're called piouses because people feel very pious that they drive, you know, a Prius. But fracking is a huge issue in this area, all across the state of California, Colorado. Whoops, I'm in Colorado. I was in California, Montana, surrounding states, Wyoming. A friend of mine just drove through Grand Junction. He hadn't been that way in a while, and he said, "You can't believe what's going on in northwestern Colorado. I mean, there are derricks everywhere. There are these huge constructions. All this, you know, this fracking mania that is going on, and there's an important ballot initiative that is coming up. Wow, almost on cue. That you know, you should, I think, look at, and if you feel comfortable, sign it. You know, get involved in this issue. It's about community rights. It's also about protecting Mother Nature from the onslaught of these drills and these derricks. I mean, what is hydraulic fracking? For the few of you that may not know exactly, it's the process of extracting oil and natural gas trapped in shale rock deep within the earth. Now, how do they do that? By forcing millions of gallons of water and over 600 toxic chemicals into the ground every time a well is fracked. So there's this huge cocktail of 600 plus chemicals, plus lots of fresh water being pumped into the ground to extract shale, into the shale rock, to extract oil and natural gas. Some are referring to the explosion in fracking as an energy boom, promising a new source of jobs and wealth. And again, our Nobel Prize-winning constitutional lawyer president, Barack Obama, has talked about energy independence as if this is some great thing. He's, this talk of Saudi America, that the United States is going to have more oil and natural gas than even Saudi America. Ask yourselves, is this something desirable? What will be the outcome? Well, the outcome for the corporations, for ExxonMobil, for Chevron Texaco, it's going to be, for BP and the others, it's going to be a boom in corporate profits. But what is it going to mean for the release of more fossil fuel greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, accelerating global warming? So down the road, there is this enormous iceberg, this enormous problem that we have to face that the system cannot look at, except with placebos. With, let's all, when is Earth Day? April 22nd? Let's all do something. Let's bike to work. Let's get some muffins from Whole Foods that they'll put out and feel good about ourselves. Come on, that's not going to do it. We've got to get out from under this mythology that we've been laboring under, that growth defined by itself is good. It cannot be good if it's destroying the environment. If we destroy the very essence of what gives us sustenance, the earth itself. What kind of deal is that? Well, in the short term, it's a great deal. It's a great deal for the capitalist owners. And there's a New Yorker cartoon that Michael Parenti, who I often feature on alternative radio, brought to my attention. A CEO is talking of a big, mining company in New York. He's talking to a bunch of stockholders, and they're really angry with him because, the dividends were down. It was predicted there'd be 15% dividends, but it was only 6%, and they're yelling at him from, the audience, what's going on? We're giving you this great salary, private jet, house in the Hamptons, a house in Aspen, penthouse in New York. What are you doing? You're not earning your salary. And he said, calm down, brothers and sisters. He didn't say brothers and sisters. He said, calm down. He said, while the long-term prospects for the planet are very grim indeed, and there are dark days ahead, in the short term, we're going to make a killing. And corporate profits will just zoom into the stratosphere. And everyone jumps to their feet and gives him a standing ovation. As if that is a desirable outcome. One of the things that capitalism does, of course, is also to atomize, to divide us, to make us into consumers. So yes, we have choices, between, is it this detergent we should use, or that detergent, this toothpaste or that toothpaste, and we can have, discussions about it. There'll be TV debates, there'll be magazine articles, but there aren't discussions about the things that really matter. Who owns the country? Who owns the economy? Who directs the economy? You never hear these things talked about. What are the driving impulses in the Middle East for U.S. foreign policy? Why is the U.S. so involved in Libya, in Syria, in threatening Iran with war time and time again, and in other countries of that region, in destroying Iraq, which is completely fragmenting now as a direct result of U.S. foreign policy? Those questions are never raised in the corporate media. They cannot even generate the idea. They cannot even get to that place where they could pose that question because they are so propagandized, they're so indoctrinated, they have so internalized the ideas that America is a democracy, it wants to spread democracy around the world, capitalism is the only economic system that can do this, and capitalism and democracy go hand in hand, and America is the indispensable nation, and we have to have the greatest military the world has ever seen, as Barack Obama has said on numerous occasions. I wish he would say we should have the greatest environment the world has ever seen, or the greatest yoga classes, or the greatest arts and dance and music and theater, and things that really matter, that give life actual meaning, rather than weapons of mass destruction. Some of these things are really shocking. I'm amazed, as informed or semi-informed as I am, when I learn that a new destroyer has just been launched called the Zumwalt, and I'm not making this up. The captain's name is Kirk, and there are two more on the drawing board. How much? $3 billion. What is the average teacher's salary in Boulder County? Which is actually much higher than most places in the United States because the tax base here is much higher. It's $50,000. How many teachers could be hired? How many schools could be built? How many parks? How many nature trails? How many recreation centers could just be built with that kind of money? But that's nothing. That's a bargain. $3 billion for one of these destroyers. They have now a new class of aircraft carriers coming off the boards. The Ford aircraft carrier coming in at a cool $13 billion a pop. F-35 is being funded. We fund weapons of mass destruction because, brothers and sisters, we're an arms trafficker. That's what we do. We're the #1 exporter of weapons around the world. So think about what the economic implications of that is. If you're a weapons manufacturer and peace breaks out, well, it's not going to be so good for arms sale. But if war breaks out, or the threat of war, then you have more and more sales. That's why the U.S. is selling, arms to these great democracies in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, great feminist strongholds like Oman, and human rights bastions such as United Arab Emirates. Yeah, we are funding some of the most reactionary, patriarchal, misogynist regimes on the face of the earth, and we're much more worried about Iran and the threat of Iran, and we have to sell weapons to these countries because Iran is threatening them. Iran is not threatening them. Iran has not invaded another country in 250 years. You can hardly go 2.5, I was going to say days, but that would be hyperbolic. You can hardly go 2.5 years in U.S. history without the U.S. attacking some country. And you hear a lot about elections, but Washington is completely hypocritical. I'm circling around here now about elections, because when people in the West Bank or in Gaza vote for Hamas, oh, we can't have that. That's an illegitimate election, so we're going to ignore that. When people in Guatemala vote for Arbenz, oh no, can't have that. That's not a legitimate election. Or Allende in Chile, can't have that. This has been happening time and time again. There are other really very acute examples of the U.S. selectively choosing which elections it will honor and which it will not honor. So to get back to environmental issues, a steady stream of reports on the deterioration of the environment is issued. There's a brief flurry of media coverage. The corporate-funded climate change deniers make counterclaims. We wake briefly to the crisis. Then most of us lapse into a couch potato stupor. Neoliberal dogma, that is to say the current form of capitalism, which relies heavily on taxpayer subsidies for weapons manufacture and export, for agriculture. Your tax money, our tax money, goes to Archer Daniels Midland, goes to Cargill, goes to Monsanto and other big agribusinesses because we like them. We're generous. The American people are generous. But when it comes to paying teachers or keeping schools open, then there's a real problem about society's priorities. Charades called climate summits, and there's one coming up in Paris in December. One recently concluded, what was it, in Doha? A very unlikely place in Qatar, I believe. And there have been a whole series of them, right? Copenhagen, Durban, others, Rio several times. And nothing happens. They get around, they say, yeah, climate change, global warming, yeah, problem. Got to do something about it. And then they have the group photo, and they have their Chardonnay or Merlot, and they all toast, we're going to save the climate. And then they go back home, and it's business as usual. It's about pumping, fossil fuels into the atmosphere. It's about coal. It's about the myth of clean coal. If you go to western Colorado, go to Paonia. It's just loaded with coal and all of that, the degradation to the atmosphere from coal dust, from all of that kind of extraction that's going on. We too easily turn our heads away from reality. I don't know why that is. And there's another report that actually asks that question, if I can find it. A very prestigious scientific report came out. I mean, there have been so many of these, it's hard to, while I'm looking for that, let me just read from Lord David Stern, a pretty conservative British guy who was asked by the British government in 2006 to look at what's happening with climate change. Well, he's recently come up with, and he issued a report then, he just issued a new report on what's happening with the climate, and he says, like others, that he far underestimated the rapidity and the speed and the acceleration of climate change and global warming. In fact, he says, the risks are even bigger than I realized when I was working on that initial review in 2006. The risks are immense. Actually, this whole article by David Stern, which was in The Guardian, which is one of the better newspapers where you can actually get some real news, not like the, the propaganda that we get in the Daily Planet or Denver Post and elsewhere. He uses the word risks multiple times. We are indeed, we're taking risks with the future for our children and grandchildren. Why would we do that? I mean, it's a question that I think befuddles a lot of people and concerns a lot of people, given the facts, given the unambiguous nature of all of this information, all of these reports that have come out over the years. I could just, okay, I will bore you with, some of them. Global water shortages pose threat of terror and war. From California to the Middle East, huge areas of the world are drying up, and 1 billion people have no access to safe drinking water. Noam Chomsky slams Canada's shale gas energy plants. And you know about Canada's tar sands project, which James Hansen, the distinguished NASA scientist, says if that goes through, it is game over for the planet. That is the tipping point. This September, Bill McKibben of 350.org has called for everyone to go to New York to the United Nations summit there to demand global action on climate change. So this tar sands project is lethal. It is the filthiest of all carbon that's out there, and it's just sitting in northern Canada, in Alberta, and there's been huge increase in cancer among the indigenous population there called First Nations, the Athabasca people. But again, they're not worthy victims. They're not white, they're not privileged, they don't pay high taxes on their McMansions, so nobody even knows what's going on in northern Alberta with all of these rare cancers caused by the mining that is going on. And the tar sands, if you can imagine, it's like a molasses seeping out of the ground, requires enormous amounts of fresh water to extract. And Obama and Kerry right now are going to decide on whether those pipelines are going to go through Nebraska and maybe Wyoming and then out to oil refineries in Texas. NASA-funded study, industrial civilization headed for irreversible collapse. Over the climate cliff. Human civilization is heading over the climate cliff with consequences even on conservative estimates that threaten the survival of the world's coastal cities as well as the viability of agriculture, fishing stocks, and fresh water supplies. Not opaque language. Very bold, very clear. Not maybe, could be, should be. It's there, it's clear. This past January, by the way, while the East Coast was freezing and a lot of people were pointing to the snowfalls on the East Coast and saying, see, this global warming is a hoax, right? Well, globally, January, and this is the latest month we have numbers for, January was the 347th consecutive month of heating, of the planet getting hotter. And so that trend continues. Here's the report I was looking for. What we know, reality, risks, and response to climate change by a very radical group calling itself Advancing Science Serving Society, the Climate Science Panel. Let me just read you their opening statement. The overwhelming evidence of human-caused climate change documents both current impacts with significant costs and extraordinary future risks to society and natural systems. So, it's not just about the penguins, as cute as they are, and the polar bears, and we love them all. It's about humanity that is ultimately at risk here, all sentient beings. The scientific community has convened conferences, published reports, spoken out at forums, and proclaimed through statements by virtually every national scientific academy and relevant major scientific organization, including the American Association for the Advancement of Science, that climate change puts the well-being of people of all nations at risk. Surveys show that many Americans think climate change is still a topic of scientific disagreement. Thus, it is important and increasingly urgent for the public to know there is now a high degree of agreement among climate scientists that human-caused climate change is real. Moreover, while the public is becoming aware that climate change is increasing the likelihood of certain local disasters, many people do not yet understand there is a small but real chance of abrupt, unpredictable, and potentially irreversible changes with highly damaging impacts on people in the United States and around the world. And then it goes on to add, it is not the purpose of this paper to explain why this disconnect between scientific knowledge and public perception has occurred. Well, I can answer that. Propaganda, corporate propaganda. Get bogus scientists, pay them money, give them their research lab, and have them produce a paper that's saying the jury's still out. It's not quite certain. People disagree. How can you be certain, so sure of this particular report? There'll always be someone who will deny anything and who can be seduced by money to say what the corporatos want. The IPCC, a very conservative organization, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it's a UN body, and they're saying that if global sea levels rise as much as 3 feet by the end of the century, which is what is being predicted, if that would be the extreme case, higher seas and warmer weather will cause profound changes. There'll be widespread flooding of coastal regions, island states will be submerged, places like Bangladesh will disappear, the Maldives, Tonga, Hawaii, places that you may have even visited, Guam, the Marshall Islands. This also has implications for U.S. foreign policy because in these votes in the UN, like on Cuba or on Israel that are critical of U.S. policy in the General Assembly, they're often like 194 to 4, and the 4 would be the United States, Israel, lockstep, automatic, and then maybe the Marshall Islands or Tonga or Palau or one of these other islands. So this will have an impact on U.S. Foreign policy. Then the votes will be 196 to 2, and the U.S. will be even further embarrassed. I'm now projecting into the year 2080. Palestine is still occupied. There's still discussions. There's still a peace process. There's still a framework. There's Secretary of States going to Geneva and Jerusalem to negotiate. And there's still votes in the UN condemning U.S. policy and the embargo on Cuba in the year 2080. And the votes are 196 to 2 in the General Assembly. I hope I'm wrong, but that's been the history of the last 50 or 60 years. It's been very consistent. So I think, we need global action. We need consciousness raising. We need information, and we need inspiration. We have to turn to those, organizations in our community that are working on these issues. There isn't much you can do about Bangladesh, and it may indeed go completely underwater. Tens of millions of people, hundreds of millions of people will be affected. We can do things here in our community. It wasn't that long ago that most of us on this planet lived on the land. That is to say, with nature. Now we are against nature. You can see this. I experienced that, right? We go into the mountains. We go into a hike. We go on a trail. We go on some beautiful flowers and things. We experience nature not immediately, under our feet, but momentarily, episodically, not on an everyday basis, which was the reality for most people living on this earth for millennia. Most people lived on the land. My parents lived on farms in Turkish Anatolia. Today there are many more billions of us, and we live in megacities, from Cairo to Karachi, Mexico City to Beijing, away from nature. We have largely distanced ourselves from the natural world. Concrete barriers separate us. We have constructed networks of highways. We have paved over our gardens and fields to build malls and subdivisions. We put up parking garages to accommodate cars while people sleep out in the street. I have an office right next to Mike's camera on Folsom. Every day I bike to work. I'm not virtuous, believe me. And homeless people are sleeping in the bushes right in that park diagonally opposite Mike's camera. I see that every day. There's another park behind the Total gas station on Folsom where the homeless emerge in the morning. They have been, sleeping there. We have plenty of money for militarism, plenty of money for the Pentagon, but not enough money or no money for human beings. We have to think about changing the whole notion of compassion and priorities. We have to be people-oriented, not corporations-oriented, which is what's happened to the political system that has been hijacked by money, that has gone now to the highest bidder. We should have numbers on the back of our, these senators and congressmen who represent us, to show which number represents which corporation that has given them the most money. So if I see number 8, I say, oh, that's not Yogi Berra, that's Starbucks. Or 14, that's not Gil Hodges, that's ExxonMobil, and so on and so forth. We'd have a better understanding of how our politics really works. It really goes to the highest bidder. So one of the reasons it's been so difficult to get priorities changed and why militarism has become so dominant in our economy and in our mindset as well. I mean, you see this whenever you go through the checkpoints. I just went through it on Saturday, flying to Anaheim at DIA. The TSA, by the way, now has 60,000 employees and a $7 billion budget. I was asked to go through the checkpoint twice, where you do this thing, step on your footprints, and then I come out and they say, we're going to have to pat you down. I said, wait a second. I just went through this $1 million machine twice, and you have to pat me down? Yes. I said, this is, what did I say? I said, this is preposterous. He said, what is preposterous? That you have to do this. Well, I have to do it, it's my job. And then he showed me the screen, and he said, there's something under your shirt. I said, yeah, there's something under my shirt. It's my nipple. and that's what it was. My nipple showed up on the scanner. That's where your taxpayer money and energy is going. It's hard to make these things up, but this is what's happening. You see kids being scanned. You see people in wheelchairs, being asked to come out of their wheelchairs. That kind of, just humiliation. I'm more worried, and you should be more worried about being a victim of random gun violence in this country, which is rampant and prevalent. Tens of thousands of Americans killed every year by gun violence by fellow Americans who believe the Second Amendment is some kind of God-given, right that Moses inscribed on the tablet, in Mount Sinai. Maybe that's the 11th commandment, is that everyone should have a gun. I'm much more worried about random violence here from fellow citizens than a possible terrorist attack. But that's a bit of a sidebar. Climate change is real. Carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere is now higher than at any time in the last 15 million years. It's largely caused by humans burning fossil fuels. The response to the evidence that the Earth is warming kicked the problem down the field. Let somebody else worry about it. I'm like that corporate executive in New York speaking to the stockholders. I care about today and tomorrow. The profits that I have to make, my salary, everything is at stake. What happens down the road? It's somebody else's problem, not mine. That is the fundamental problem with capitalism. It has no long-range vision. It cannot address this particular issue. So there cannot be, you may have heard about Bhutan, the Himalayan kingdom, 600,000 people. They have a very enlightened political leadership. They've passed many very progressive environmental laws, but that's little Bhutan. It's not going to really matter. What matters is when collectively the planet gets together and addresses the issue. It cannot be one small Himalayan state addressing climate change. It has to be done collectively. And that's a word the capitalists are afraid of. Because as soon as you say collectivization, they say, oh, you want to redistribute profits. You want to take our hard-earned money from our pockets that we sweated for. You know, most of it, by the way, is inherited wealth. Most of it is as a result of tax dodges and other scams that their lawyers and accountants work out for them, and all of the, you know, bank accounts they have in the Cayman Islands, and they don't pay taxes here. But they like to, you know, trumpet themselves. You know, we're all Horatio Algers. We've, you know, we've created our wealth through our enormous enterprise and dedication and sincerity. We've pulled ourselves up from the proverbial bootstraps. So what is required to arrest and reverse the clear threats to Earth is a radical shift in thinking. It cannot be delayed any longer, and we have to do it now. So getting involved in your community, the Rocky Mountain Peace and Justice Center, this particular initiative here to restore more sovereignty and democracy. Democracy is under attack. It's under siege, just like Gaza, without the Israeli bombs. You know, they control the air, they control the sea, they control the land, you know, and we are penned in, you know, surrounded by corporate power. We have to figure out ways to break through that corporate power, to create cooperatives, to create worker-run businesses and enterprises. And you know about Mondragon in Spain? You know, very successful. It was started by a Basque priest. It was started by a Catholic priest in the Basque country in 1956, because this was the poorest area of Spain. They didn't have Jack, S-H-I-T. We're being filmed here, so in case this is broadcast, you cannot, because we're very pure in this country. We can't say certain words, you know, words that I know you've never heard, and I wouldn't dare utter them in front of you. So we can spell them out. Now I just interrupted myself with that joke. This is the plague of being a Gemini. Huh? Mondragon. Domo arigatou gozaimasu. Thank you. Mondragon today is the 7th largest business in all of Spain. Even during the economic collapse, which has hit Spain in a monumental way, there's 25–30% unemployment in Spain today. No one was laid off from Mondragon. Over 100,000 people are employed in that, you know, cooperative where workers make the decisions, where workers are the owners, where there's profit sharing. I don't know, you know, you want to call this socialism or whatever you want to call it. It seems to work in this instance. And there have been a number of successful companies here in the United States that you haven't heard about because the corporate media doesn't want you to know that there are cooperatives and they are successful, because that might give you the idea, hey, why don't I start my own, you know, enterprise? So Ace Hardware, who would have thought? Land O'Lakes Butter is a cooperative. One of the major, not Liberty Insurance, one of the major insurance companies is a cooperative. There are all tens of thousands of cooperatives are springing up all over the country, not just around food, but also in other areas. When I was walking in the Mission District on Valencia in San Francisco about a year or two ago, I looked up and I saw worker-owned and operated, Aris Mendez Bakery. I said, well, I went in naturally and said, you know, what's this about? Who is Ari Mendez? Ari Mendez turns out to be the name of that Spanish Catholic priest that started Mondragon. And these people in the Bay Area have now started 6 bakeries and cafes that are worker-owned and operated, and they're thriving. They're really doing well. You know, we should be supporting farmers markets. We should be community-supported agriculture. Very, very important. It is, you know, Arundhati Roy asked the question, is another world possible? It is possible if we can imagine it, if we can get beyond our, you know, iPhones and iPads and iMacs and think imaginatively about a future where our children and our grandchildren and this magnificent creation, this pale blue dot in the universe, as Carl Sagan called planet Earth, you know, exists for future generations. Thank you very much.
Anybody need to sign?
Sign the home rule petition. It's right here. Can you have volunteers?